We're going to be listening to a comrade who is a writer, researcher, and a founding member of the London-based Algeria Solidarity Campaign. He also works with the Environmental Justice Network in North Africa, as well as Environmental Food Sovereignty Network in North Africa. We're trying to kidnap him and make him work in West Africa. Of course, we are very, in Home Health and in our circles, we never use the term Sub-Saharan Africa because we're one Africa. Nobody's going to use the desert to divide this continent. Or no, sometimes they even say Sub-Saharan Africa except South Africa. Can you imagine that? They cut Africa into three. This is absolute nonsense. Africa is Africa, not Sub-Saharan, not beyond Sahara, not inside Sahara. Now, Hamza has written a whole lot on climate, food, trade, and energy issues. He's written in The Guardian, Counterpunch, New Internationalist, Red Pepper, Jadalia, and Open Democracy, Pambazuka, and Huffington Post. I want to now give the floor to Hamza to speak to us on power and energy alternatives in Northern Africa, or in Africa, if you like.
Thanks, Nemo, for this warm introduction. I'm happy to be here and to be learning together with everybody. What I like to focus today would be the politics of any green, what they call Green New Deal or energetic transitions to renewables. And I think Ikal touched on this, but it's always important to emphasize. Based on my research and activism in North Africa and my work on extractivism and energy democracy, I'd like to bring some light into the power relations and the hierarchy of the international energy system that are rooted in colonial and neo-colonial legacies and practices of exploitation, plunder of resources, land grabs, especially in the global south. What I want us to be aware of is that any just transition to renewables needs to take into account these histories and these power relations in order to not perpetuate the same practices of exploitation, the same cruel practices of pauperizations that we've seen for a long time in the global south. So in our popular imaginary, when we talk about energy, usually the things that come to our mind are coal, oil, and gas. And most of these resources actually come from countries in the global south. Countries like Nigeria, Algeria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Venezuela, and so on. The mode of grabbing those resources and controlling them and plundering them is called extractivism. And that extractivism is a manifestation of fossil capitalism. So what is extractivism? Extractivism is a mode of appropriation and accumulation that has been unleashed all over the planet since 1492 with the conquest of the Americas. And as you can imagine, it has been shaped by violence, by slavery, by colonialism, and by sheer robbery. Extractivism is incompatible with social justice because of its disastrous social and environmental consequences. It has been creating what Naomi Klein called sacrifice zones with sacrificial people in order to maintain the accumulation of capital. And it's important to note here that the mechanisms of othering people and the racial nature of capitalism is important here. So let's come back to North Africa or the Maghreb and see how extractivism and the search to control energy resources manifest themselves there. Basically, all the economies of the region are inserted in a subordinate position into a profoundly unjust global division of labor. In one hand, we are providers of cheap natural resources and a reservoir of cheap labor. And in the other hand, we are a market for industrialized economies. And this goes, I think, for all the African continent. And this has been imposed again by colonialism, and attempts to break away from it through the decolonization process in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have been defeated in a way. So those sacrifice zones that Naomi Klein has been talking about are present in all the sites of extractivism, including fossil fuels in North Africa. We have Ain Saleh and Wargla in Algeria, we have Gebs and Tatawin in Tunisia, Imidar and Safi in Morocco, and so on. And extractivism cannot be disentangled from the imperialist machinations and the militarist governance of the world. And Iraq and Libya warrants more attention here, as they have been the victims of the violence associated with fossil fuels and the Western fighter jets and bombs that go searching for their abundance. So in a nutshell, the people of North Africa, and generally the African continents and other people in the global south, have been experiencing extractivism as colonialism or as neo-colonialism. You might say, but these countries are independent and they are making their own choices. The answer is simply not true, because that decolonization process is still ongoing, at least at the economic level. We are still dependent on multinationals, subordinated to multinationals. We are still subordinated to the interests of Western powers and rising powers like China right now. And on top of that, most of all these countries are ruled by corrupt and authoritarian elites, supported by Western governments to maintain their own interests. The priority is always the interests of Western democracies to secure their energy sources, and that trumps on the democratic and human rights of the people. So basically what I wanted to say is that the people in North Africa generally do not have popular sovereignty on their natural resources, and in a way they do not have a say on the economic orientation of their economies. And one of the examples that people are angry against this is the uprising taking place right now in Algeria. People actually claiming popular sovereignty over their natural resources and the redistribution of wealth. I just want to mention an example about the hypocrisy of some of the Western powers when they talk about the transition towards renewables. And I'm specifically talking about France and Total here. France banned fracking on its own territory, so Total couldn't do fracking in France. But at the same time, the French government was providing diplomatic support for Total to go to dig and frack in Algeria, its former colony. So if this is not energy colonialism or environmental racism, I don't know what it is. I just like now to say something about those renewables. Some of those renewable projects, and Ikal rightly and eloquently touched on this, can be extractivist in themselves and can be reproducing the same mechanisms of oppression and exploitation and dependency. And I can give you examples, concrete examples in North Africa, one from Morocco, the Ouarzazate solar plant, and one in Tunisia called the Tunur solar plant. The Ouarzazate solar plant was launched in 2016, just before the climate talks, the COP22 in Marrakesh. It was praised to be the largest solar plant on the world, and the Moroccan monarchy was declared to be a champion of renewable energy. But when we try to look into the details of that project, another picture just emerges. First, the plant was installed on the land of some Amazigh, agro-pastoralist communities without their consent and their approval. So that land that they were using for pasturing was taken away from there for a supposedly green agenda. And in a way, it's just a land grab. some people call it a green grab. Second, this is a huge project controlled by private interests. It is owned, run by a Moroccan private company and a Saudi one. Third one, it has been built by contracting huge debts, $9 billion from the World Bank, from the European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, and others. And all of this is backed by Moroccan guarantees. What it means for a hugely indebted country like Morocco, which the debts are weighing even more on the people of Morocco right now, if that project fails, or if the two private companies cannot pay those debts, it will be the Moroccan themselves who will be paying this. Fourth, the energy would be expensive and still expensive. And there are even plans and talk about exporting that energy to Europe. And fifth, the project is not that green as it claims to be. It's using a technology called the CSP technology, the concentrated thermal power, and needs considerable amounts in order to clean and cool down the panels. And in a semi-arid region like Ouarzazate, diverting that water that is being used for drinking and agriculture toward a project like this, it doesn't make sense. So what kind of renewable transition we are talking about? The same thing is happening in the Tunisian project. So the Tunisian project, it's in the process of being, I think, gathering money and trying to get approval for it. But they have a website, and it's a joint venture between British, Maltese, and Tunisian entrepreneurs. They want to build a much bigger solar plant than the Ouarzazate in southern Tunisia, in the Sahara again. And basically, they don't shy away from saying that the primary objective of this project is to export energy to Europe. That's what they're saying. In order for Europe to meet its, carbon reduction targets. So again, the same mentality of extraction, the same practices of land grabbing, and while Tunisians are not self-sufficient in energy themselves, they get energy from Algeria, from the neighboring country. So for me, it's just a familiar colonial scheme that is being rolled out in front of our eyes. We see the unrestricted flow of natural resources, including this time the sun power, from the global south to the countries of the north. And at the same time, Fortress Europe builds walls and fences to not allow human beings, and Africans in this case, to reach its shores. Just to conclude, I think in a regional context of forced liberalizations and the pushing for unjust trade deals, because unjust trade deals is another neo-colonial way of appropriating resources, as well as the scramble for influence and the control of energy resources, green transitions and talk about sustainability must not become a shiny facade for neo-colonial schemes of plunder and domination. Any green transition must fundamentally transform our economic systems. Those huge renewable projects, like what I told you, the Ouarzazate and Tannour solar plant, while they portray themselves with good intentions, often sugarcoat brutal exploitation and robbery. We must always ask the fundamental questions: who owns what? Who does what? Who gets what? Who wins and who loses? The fight for climate justice needs to take into account the different responsibilities and vulnerabilities between countries of the North and the South, and ecological and climate debt must be paid to countries in the global South who happen to be the hardest hit by the climate crisis and being locked into extractivism and reliance on the exporting of natural resources by global capitalism and predatory extractivism. And finally, to implement a just and truly green projects which provide for the future of the planet and people, we must take nature back from the clutches of big capital and recast the debate around questions of justice, popular sovereignty, and the collective good. The priority must be energy autonomy for local communities and a radical democracy that takes precedence over the logic of the market that sees our land, our livelihoods as commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. Thank you.